Hi, my name is Chris Hardwick, and I live in Middleton, Wisconsin, and my favorite event is 5x5 blindfolded. I'm 31, and fun fact about me is I'm actually going back to school right now. I'm switching careers, and I'm doing something math-related. I've always liked knowing about math and using math in the community, in the cubing community, and now I'm going back to school to be an actuary. I guess the way I got started for cubing is the first time I ever saw a Rubik's Cube in my whole life, I was in second grade on the school bus on the way home. And there was this older kid who had a cube, didn't want it, and said, just pick a number 1 to 10, whoever gets closest gets this cube. I picked his number, so he gave me this cube, and I remember even the first couple of turns, I was totally hooked. Something about the way it turned and the colors on it, I thought this was the greatest thing. I was able to get one side and just gave up from that point, and it was about 6 or so years later. I was going into high school, and it was over the summer. And I was just bored looking for something to do. I found that old cube and figured out, basically thought, I definitely want to learn to solve this. And went on the internet and learned a solution. And about a month later, I discovered Jessica Friedrich's website with the Friedrich method, as it was called at the time. And just that completely got me hooked. And I've been cubing pretty actively ever since. I think some of the big differences between competitions from the early days, like 2003, 2004, and then up to modern day, gosh, let's see. The size of the competition is one that definitely comes to mind. Competitions used to be a lot smaller, and the age difference was a little bit more geared toward older, maybe like late high school, early 20s, and then also you'd have people in their 30s and 40s who had been around in the early 80s during that period. Nowadays, my impression is that you get a lot of people who are, I would think, much younger, maybe around 10 through 12 or something like that, who are really good, who have what I consider to be a really high level of skill, but they're much younger than people of comparative skill level back in 2003 and 4. So that's a big difference I've noticed. Competitions nowadays are run much more efficiently than they used to be. Now we've got whole systems like the runner system, where you'll have a runner take stuff from the scrambling table out to the judges. The judge sits at the table the whole time and works the solve there. There was no runner most times. The judge would go to the scrambling table, pick up the cube, call the name, and then go judge the person, and then bring it back to the scrambling table. And that had a lot of bottlenecks at the scrambling table, especially if a competitor had a question. So general impression is that they're much more efficient nowadays because people are finding out what works and teaching other people. As far as the events that I've held world records in, it started with 3x3 one-handed, and it was in part due to not as many people were doing it. That was my initial interest. And then I started realizing I was getting pretty competitive pretty quickly in one-handed. So I started really focusing on it. And shortly before Worlds 2003, I decided this is probably my main event. So I just absolutely focused my practice on one hand. And I was really excited. I won the world championship there and set the single world record, which at the time it was just best time is what won the competition. The main idea would probably be that I was really focusing on that event, maybe more so than others who maybe even had a higher skill level, but I just put more time into it at that point. But once I set that record, then Mackie and Ryan Patricio, Shotaro Makasumi and Ryan Patricio came in, and they had the actual skill level and they put in the time, so they kind of took over from that point. 4x4 was a little similar. Once I realized that Mackie and Ryan Patricio were definitely far surpassing anything that I could probably hope to do on one hand, I got really interested in 4x4. And I had been interested in 4x4 since I started cubing. So I already had some techniques for it, and I was already working on some methods, and I just really delved into that 100%. I wanted to be the best I could be at 4x4 and innovate methods and everything. And in 2004, I was the US national champion for 4x4. And in 2005, going into Worlds, I was hoping to podium, and I did. I got third place in 4x4 in that event. And in between that time, I set the single world record, the 55.38. That was probably my peak in terms of my skill level at that point. And then a lot of other people, seeing the influx of 4x4 practicing, had the skill level and were putting in the same amount of time that I was. So they started far surpassing me. And that's about the time I started developing issues with my wrist. I do have I get sort of twinges in my wrist here. So that's one of the reasons that for most of my cubing, I'm not really been that much into the speed solving events because I really have to watch it. If I cube too much, especially big cubes, I'll get some pain in my forearm. So at that point, I realized speed cubing, I've probably peaked, at least for 4x4. I'm starting to get these problems with my wrist. I want to move on to something else. And what I noticed was at the 2005 Worlds, nobody was world champion in 4 or 5 blind. There were several people competing in it, but everybody got a DNF, which of course can happen in a big blind event. But I sort of saw that as an opportunity, and I said, well, this event is hard. You don't always get a solve. I want to try this event. It sort of, to me, I took it as a challenge of, that's a tough event. Even the people who are experts don't always get a solve. I want to jump into that event and see what I can do. I just love blindfolded, and even to this day, it's still by far my main events are the blindfolded ones. And I guess the world records for those were, I was one of the earliest people doing it. I wasn't the first by any stretch, but I was one of the earlier people who were really involved in it. And I contacted the memory sports community. In particular, Ben Pridmore helped me a lot, who's a world champion level memory sports practitioner. And I basically laid out everything about what a blindfolded cuber needs. And I said, what kind of memory method should I have? And he gave me a bunch of advice back. So that's when I started using letter pair memory, a method of loci, all that stuff. And I got all that from Ben Pridmore. And then when I started using that, my times jumped down drastically because it's just a better method. I was using just ad hoc kind of stuff before that. And of course, over the years, people who, the way I think of it is people who have a really strong skill in the event, who put in as much time as I did, they started surpassing my times. I would say there was Richard Carr, Dave Orser, Stefan Pachman. I know Dror Vomberg, who was one of the early world champions in 4 blind, and he was also trying for 5 blind at the time. He had done 5 blind well before I did. And then I guess I was 5th. There may have been a couple other people doing it in the 80s. I think the thing I like about blindfold solving the most is it's just such a rush when you think you're done, you put the cube down, you pull the blindfold up, and the cube really is solved. All the turns you thought you did, you really did do exactly like that. I've always enjoyed that feeling. I just like, another thing too is I really enjoy how when you really get into blind solving, how you can visualize your memorization, and the more you do it, you can kind of see not only the part you're working on, but that part's out past that, and it almost feels like you can actually see the solve, like in the sense of a sighted solve. So it's a neat feeling. Like sometimes you don't even feel like you're blindfolded. You feel like you're looking at the cube in your mind just like you would be looking at a sighted solve. That's a really cool feeling for me. That's another reason I like blind solving. This one, like, it's kind of weird. I have letter pairs that stick out to me in my memory more, and they work better than others. One is RK, which is rake, and you just picture like a garden rake, which sounds a little boring, but in your memory, you need to be, I was told this by Ben Pridmore, the idea is you need to be funny, sexy, or violent. And something about that combination allows you to remember things better. And rake is just, he's a jerk. He's kind of an asshole. Like, rake will like attack everything. Imagine a possessed rake that is just going nuts and like slashing and hacking everything nearby. So for whatever reason, that one's always very memorable because it's kind of funny. Like comic book over the top kind of violence, something like that. BX is boxer. That's a good one because the boxer will just, you can have the most mundane, sweetest like librarian sitting there, but then a boxer comes up and it's just like, and again, like, picture this in the context of like cartoony, kind of over the top, sort of funny, like cartoon violence, I guess. Developing BH, I met Daniel Byer. So BH, I guess, is Byer Hardwick. Byers for Daniel, Hardwick's for me. Daniel and I both realized we enjoyed blindfolded a lot, so we wanted to really develop this into more of a system. And we both are math-minded people. Daniel's really good at math, has done really well at calculus in school, and I like the math side as well. So we started saying, how can we turn this into a move optimal system? And we basically broke it down case by case. We listed every case out for all the pieces. I guess we started with edges of a 3x3, and we looked at every possible arrangement we could think of 3 different edges, and how can you solve them in the fewest number of turns. The first thing that comes to mind is commutators. So we were using commutators for almost all the cycles, and then we started noticing the relationships of the different types of setups of pieces, and then we classified them as 8 movers, 9 movers, 10, 11, and 12. And edges don't have the 12 movers, but you get that for the corners. And then we said, okay, we have edges figured out, let's now do corners of a 3x3. Then we moved on to the 5x5. BH is really written to be a 5x5 blind method, and extensions to 7x7 and 6x6 and all that. So we did X centers, T centers, and then the wing edges. And then once you had a 5x5 blind method, you can extend that to 3x3 or whatever other cube you want. So, but it was a joint effort of us trying to figure out all the cases. We run them by each other. Can you come up with a faster way to do this one? And really, faster meant fewer turns for us at the time. Can you do this in fewer turns? And then we would just optimize it as best we can. And we only used computers for the really long cases, like the 12 movers on corners. But everything else we did manually, just thinking about it, trying to figure out the shortest turns to solve that case. My first 5 blind success was probably practicing at home, and I don't actually remember the first unofficial one that I just did at home. I remember some early solves, really getting really excited, and I imagine I jumped up and down and screamed and was like, ah! I mean, you get a lot of emotion on the first solve. The first solve that I really remember very well, and it's burned in my memory, is it was the Chattahoochee competition in 2006. That's when I got my first world record in 5 blind. Stefan Pachman had it at like 2.5 hours. I think it was 2 hours 38 minutes, and then I broke it at 55 minutes, which at the time was a big jump because I was using a different method. But I remember I was in shock. I was in disbelief. I actually remember kind of putting my hands to my face and just laying down on the floor and just being like, I can't believe I got it. I remember that solve very clearly because I was just, I had done it officially. It was a world record. I was just over the top. It was fun. Okay, I definitely want to say 7x7 blindfolded, to throw that out there. I've done that one a couple times, and it is the absolute limit of my memory right now. And I know multi-blind does well beyond that, like Mascow and those people who are really good at multi-blind is much more than a 7x7. But something about that is just right at the edge of what I can hold on to without forgetting. So I feel really proud of having done 7x7. I've done a 4x4 multi-blind of 4 4x4s, and I got that successfully. I've done that a couple times. And I can't remember which one of those is technically more information, but I feel more excited about the 7x7 blind solve. I think as skill levels have increased, I definitely have seen, and I've heard other cubers talk about this too, where you get people that they're kind of in it for the competition and they're less in it for the community or the friendship. And you had some of that in the early days too. People who were really fast, who kind of came in as like the prodigy and they just like swept the records and stuff, but they were just in it to be there to win. You had a little bit of that in the early days, but I guess I do see like I call it outward competition, where people they're there to podium and then that's it. That's what they want to do. I see that a bit more, but I don't know. I guess I don't think it's too bad in most cases, but like sometimes it does seem like people get very competitive. I guess I do sometimes see stuff like on the forums. In the early days, it was easy because all the questions were new. If you asked a question, it kind of didn't matter if somebody had asked it before because the forum hadn't really been around that long, and even the early Yahoo. Like speed solving, the Rubik's Cube group, people were just there to answer questions. But now that the community has existed for so long, the forum for some questions, like let's say a beginner or intermediate cuber asking a question, it's already there on the forum somewhere. And I do see people kind of jump to like, hey, you should just search for that. That's already here. And in some sense, some of these questions have been answered so many times. You really should just look up this thread because it's excellent. It's a good resource. It explains your question very well. But I don't know. Sometimes that seems like it comes down a little too harsh. So I don't know. Maybe that's just my personal opinion. But I do sometimes see people snap a little too quickly when maybe they just did have like a quick question or hey, check out this thread, something like that. I mean, the one that I definitely am really happy about is that I actually met my wife because of the cube. And it wasn't at a competition or at an event or anything like that, but she's a member of Mensa, and I'm not a member of Mensa, but I was invited to speak at one of their events to give a talk on the cube. Basically some blindfold theory, how it works, how do you solve it, all that stuff. And again, Mensans, these are smart people, they were able to pick it up even though they're not cubers necessarily. They got the theory side of it. So I gave that talk. And my wife, Katie, was at that event. She wasn't at the talk, but I went to the game room later, and that's where I met her, playing board games and all that. So I think I'll kind of wrap this up more generally. My favorite part of cubing is the opportunities it gives you outside of cubing. So for me, I met my wife because of the cube. I wouldn't have been at that event had I not been into the cube and asked to come to give a talk for that. So that's definitely, I guess, my favorite memory in terms of what the cube has brought me in my life. I guess in terms of other hobbies, I definitely still enjoy math. I like hobby style stuff, reading books on math. Geometry in particular is a favorite of mine. I'm also reading Gödel Escher Bach. I was reading at one point about a famous math proof. So just learning more about that is fun. I've always liked throwing a frisbee around. That's a fun one. I really like to go hiking, and one that I really want to get into more is cave exploring or spelunking, but I usually just call it caving. As I start cubing less and less over time, I don't think I'll ever retire, but you know, as life moves on, I guess, kind of thing, if I'm ever cubing less and less, I really want to start getting into cave exploring more, and that's just something I really enjoy a lot. And there are a lot of caves nearby. There's Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, which is about a day's drive away. That really entices me. It's one of the best cave systems in the world. There's a cave system like 30 minutes from my house, so you know that's something I could definitely get into a lot more. I think I'm gonna go 2011 Worlds, which is in Bangkok, Thailand, and it's not necessarily just the competition. The competition was great. For me, it was a whole new cultural experience. That was my first time ever going to Asia, and completely different culture. People were really nice, but the competition itself was just massive. There were, I think, 33 or so countries represented, and they had all the flags of all the countries lined up all the way down by the stage. I really thought that was a neat effect. That had been done before, but the particular way these were lined up was really nice. They did a traditional Thai dance at the end, right before the award ceremony, so you got to see some of the culture there. People were really nice. Plus, the hotel was huge. It was like 100 floors, I think, or at least in the high 90s. So if you got to go to the top observation deck, it was a beautiful view all the way around. And I got to hang out with a lot of really cool cubers. I was rooming with Brendan Valance, Sebastian, and Ro Hessler, which was really cool. We were kind of joking because at the time we were either all, at the end of the competition, we were either all current or former world champions. Plus, there's just a great group of guys to hang out with. Sebastian Aru, because there are a lot of Sebastians. But that was a fun time. Just all in all, I think that was probably one of my favorites, if not my top one. I think I know the answer to that right off the bat. Would be, there have been a couple of times where I've set my actual personal best in competition. And the one that sticks out in my mind the most was my 4 minutes, 46 second 4x4 blindfold solve, which at the time was my personal best, but it was also the world record. And that, if I have the video of that one up on YouTube, somebody filmed it. I don't have it, but somebody put it up there. And I just jumped up and down because I was excited because it was my personal best. That's what clicked first, and then I realized, wait a minute, that's world record. So that was like over the top. I think that's the one that I'm the most like excited about. That's the one. That's my accomplishment that I really like went off the wall like celebrating. Let's see, why do I keep cubing? I keep cubing because when I don't cube, I don't like it. I feel weird if I don't ever practice at all, which sometimes happens. If work is extra busy or if I have a lot of homework at school, I might go like a month without practicing at all. And by the end of that, I'm just like, I need to do a solve. This doesn't feel right. Cubing is very motivational for me. It keeps me sane. It like centers me. And I don't know, just something about it is very meditative for me. And if I don't have that element in my life, I feel off. Something's not quite right. And once I start cubing a little bit again, I just kind of mellow out back to normal. I guess I've gotten this question a lot, especially back in the early days. The reason I used to always stand at a solve is in the early days, we were all just sort of innovating anything and everything that would give you an advantage. And at the time, the advantage I thought it might be giving me, I don't know if this is true, is that while you're standing, you're more physically active in some sense, so there's a little more blood flow. And I used to do like small exercises and stuff right before solving as well, just in case that like extra blood flow might work. But I also felt like when I was standing, my chest was upright more and I was breathing in better. Because I know if your neck is down like that, you get less airflow in, so there's less oxygen to the brain. Nowadays I sit more often. I might still stand if I can't focus. Because I've stood so much when solving in a competition, it's sort of muscle memory for my body to know, okay, now it's time to solve, like this is serious now. So if I'm having a hard time focusing in a competition, I will still stand because that muscle memory kicks back in. Like, oh, you're standing, that means it's time to really focus, and then I'll get in that focus mode again. I definitely get asked this one a lot. I still do. I wear the goggles. They're like horse blinders. I heard somebody call them today. Basically, I took swimming goggles. I spray painted them black, and then I took a drill and drilled holes through the eyes. And what they do is they limit my field of view to a small circle that's about this big. Essentially, all I can see is the cube and like my hands. And the reason I wear them is when I'm in a big competition, I have a really hard time focusing because of the crowd, just like visual disturbance. So people walking around and moving distracts me, and I do worse. And at first it was an experiment. I wore them in 2011 at Worlds for the first time, and I did pretty well for me. And then over the years, the competitions I've been going to, when I wear the goggles, I consistently do better than when I don't. And actually at the Whisk Cube competition that I just attended recently, wearing the goggles, I set my competition PB average. And at Worlds 2015 in Brazil, I came very close to my competition PB average. I was within 0.07 of my competition PB for 3x3 with the goggles, and that was because I just can't see anything but the cube. I feel like I'm at my desk practicing. Okay, I kind of like this event, and I've started competing in it recently, but I guess if I had to remove an event, it would be clock. And I'm not saying this in any like official capacity, it's just like a personal opinion. I guess it's the one that's least like the other twisty puzzles. I still consider it a twisty puzzle, but I don't know, I guess it's the one that's like the most further afield than the other ones. So, but I don't know, I still enjoy it, having said that. I think I have one piece of cubing advice this is the one that's affected me the most, so I like to tell people, and that is, I think personally it works better if you try to compete inwardly and not outwardly. So the idea being, if you compete outwardly, you'll say things like, I want a podium, I want to set the world record, I want to, basically anything that compares yourself to other cubers. Competing inwardly would be like, I want to get sub 15, I want to get sub 10, I want to get sub 9 or 8 or something like that, because that's just based on your times. I have competed both ways in the time I've been queuing, and I am much more unhappy and just like angry and like enjoying myself less if I compete outwardly. So if I plan to try to set a world record, if I plan to try to podium, something like that, if you flip it over on its head and say, pick the world record time, and then just say, I want to be sub that time, or I just want to be sub whatever time I am now, then you have a much more enjoyable time at competition. So that's my advice.